Welcome back to the Torque Test channel. On our last visit to hand tools, we tested 12-point versus 6-point and spline box ends on wrenches to try and determine which design has the advantage of slipping the least there, which I think we did. But many of you, and us included, wanted to see just how well the other end of the wrench, the open end, performed between brands, since that end appeared to perform less than half as well in our testing, so any advantage between options out there would probably go a long way for you. So today we're testing 16 different examples and 14 different brands, from $454 a set to $19, measuring peak torque before slipping on soft steel fasteners, comparing their results to their open end thickness for some better context on our rank list, seeing if a 5/8 wrench can be used in place of a 16mm or vice versa, myth busting the popular valve grinding compound hack to see if that works, measuring each wrench's open end for precision, and finally hardness testing with some illuminating stuff there as well. Now, there's no way to cover all the brands out there in one episode, so let us know which ones we should include if we do more of these. Sure wish Icon with this FDX-like design had made wrenches for sale individually. While testing to failure might be dramatic and not impossible to experience on the open end side of wrenches, it's maybe not quite as useful to what brand will work best for you, because when space only allows for the open end on a bolt head, we're usually way more worried about it slipping than breaking in half, for instance. Which means grade 8 bolts and coupling nuts make a return to the channel. This shiny grade 2 hardware is about as soft as you'll come across on fasteners, so it represents about as worst case scenario as we can reliably make repeatable for each wrench. We'll be using 16mm wrenches to match this hex size and be extracting data from the point just before they slip on these new unmolested coupling nuts in the form of bolt tension PSI. Each new test will be getting a new bolt, nut, and washer, 3 tests per wrench. The median result will be shown on screen. In case you're curious, the multiplier here is going to be 12.7 to 1, or basically divide the value you see on screen by 12.7 for foot-pounds or 5.77 for kilograms, if you feel so inclined. We have a lot of wrenches to get to though, so let's jump in. In order of price that we're going to be going, we have the Olympia. While at the bolt supply store getting hardware for this testing, I saw this single 16mm wrench hanging up on the wall for $1.89, which was cheaper than the cheapest we had for testing. Its clearance on a bolt when zeroed for 16mm is 0.11mm over, which is actually very good, as you'll be seeing. Though as you probably noticed, this wrench is not exactly pretty in the fit and finish department. A rough drop forging from India that is ultimately able to muster, as you're going to see here, 930 psi before slipping and rounding the nut. We'll have to see how good that is versus the others. And all the wrenches from today's, their 12-point box ends were able to max out and start to squish the non-rounded 16mm coupling nuts from today, so it's not very interesting to be comparing them in that regard. Next up is the cheapest full set that included 16mm on Amazon, the Jetech. $25 for a set of 11 pieces, or $2.27 a piece. These are made in China, and for precision of its clearance, it's 0.25mm over, way over that previous Olympia. We're going to be testing all these with the 15-degree sort of offset on these combination wrenches out towards the camera on each test, and measuring just before the wrench slips, as additional bolt tension created from it marring the nut wouldn't help you very much. So this one sees 1014 psi, a nice increase over the Olympia for not a ton more money. Wait, hold up, does wrench side matter on open ends, even if you do end up needing to flip it over back and forth? In my experience, it always seemed to. We tested 8 times with a Matco Silver Eagle set that's no longer for sale, so we didn't include it in this testing series. We also sort of tried standing on both the push and pull sides of this. We kept getting the same results, and we thought maybe the extender needed to be more in alignment with the wrench, so we tried our other extender. Still the same deal. Seems odd to me, might be specific to our setup. But anyways, back to the show. Now let's see how a name brand you've probably heard of does, Crescent. Crescent as a brand didn't do too amazingly in our flare nut wrench testing, but you'd have to admit it finally looks the part, at least. And this is $28 for a 10-piece set, or $2.80 a wrench. Pretty affordable. Its 0.23mm clearance measurement isn't off to an awesome start. And in testing, the Crescent brand combination wrench gets off to a good start, but soon slips after generating just 911 psi. The lowest so far, something we've verified with 2 additional tests as usual. Next up in price is the Craftsman, and just like in our last wrench testing, we'll be including both vintage USA raised panel and a modern Craftsman offering, this time one you can still find at Lowe's and on Amazon, their current raised panel wrench set, which is just $33 or $3 a wrench. The China model is coming out the gate with a tighter clearance of 0.11 millimeters versus 0.14. But that old school USA raised panel we're testing here is just a classic, basically 90s Americana if you ask me. Not that this history has helped it much in its flare nut wrench testing video, but here, yeah, it crushes it. It makes it up way up past the other two into first place with 1319 PSI, which is quite good. Their current China example now, though, is no slouch in popularity. It is in the top 50 best-selling wrench sets on all of Amazon, so I think that popularity with the Craftsman brand continues on in some way. And it seems like in this case, for very good reason too, this 16mm example is able to pile on the PSI quite well for ultimately the current second position, putting both Craftsman wrenches at the top for now. Up next is Sunex, with a surprisingly affordable $36 set or $3.02 a wrench. Though looking at the label, this may be in part due to these being made in India. Most of the Sunex we've had luck with, like their great pinned universal, has been made in Taiwan. And this is our first wrench today to feature a specialty open end as well, this one with a V-groove at the base of the mouth, which as a design just sort of makes sense when using on a hex, but we'll get into that a bit later. And its clearance is coming in at 0.2 millimeters. One thing you have to remind yourself to do with this wrench is to seat the open end deep into the jaw, all the way into the hex, because it's easy for this one to slip and push itself out like it did for us. But even when all the way into the throat, this wrench did less than we were expecting, 1030 PSI. Nothing really to write home about. Next we have the Tekton, a $54 set and $4.50 a piece, but Taiwan now, which Tekton is known for nowadays. The wrench's clearance measures 0.21 millimeters, and in testing the wrench felt very no nonsense and gripped until it sort of just all of a sudden didn't and let go at 1273, very good, enough for second place at the moment. Next up is Capri, that we purchased in both 16mm and 5/8 to be able to show you that difference if there is one. This Taiwan-made combination wrench can only be found in their 19-piece master set for $150 total, but that's still $7.89 a wrench, which is a ways up from the $4.50 Tekton. 5/8 is one of those sizes that can be used in place of metric, 16mm here, sort of like 19mm and 3/4, but not quite that close. So we're curious to see if there is a performance difference. The 16mm clearance measures 0.26 millimeters, the worst so far, and the 5/8 0.19 or 0.06 millimeters less. So let's see for ourselves. Despite being a bit oversized in measurement and feel, the Capri does grip some nice torque. Our gauge display times out here, but we were able to still bring out that data for you. Makes it up to 1213. Now here's the 5/8 inch Capri wrench on a new nut. Remember, we have 1213 from the 16mm to beat here. $1,209, I'd say that's pretty definitely a yes. You can use them interchangeably, and shows that, at least on this brand, wrench design is more important than dimensional tolerance, as the Olympia displayed as well, though it can't hurt to do both well. Climbing up again in price from the Capri, we have the Gearwrench. Now this one isn't really fair pricing wise, not that we have been scoring them that way, but we wanted to test one of Gearwrench's ratcheting wrenches because, you know, it is Gearwrench, and thus far on the channel the brand has not done super hot on non-ratcheting stuff, some of which is made in China and might just be rebadged Crescent, the same parent company, so we want to see how their Taiwan stuff, the wrenches they're known for, fares. This one measures 0.12 millimeters over, already a very good start. The open end looks pretty chunky, but it inspires confidence. It's a very solid purchase on the coupling nut and doesn't waver way up the ranking to first place tested so far with 1392 PSI. That thick open end is helping it, of course. Not every bolt head is going to have enough meat on the top for you to take advantage of that thickness, which is why on our rank chart we're also going to be listing PSI of bolt tension per millimeter of open end thickness as seen here. The Gearwrench's 1392 is very impressive, but also it's taking up 9.5 millimeters in thickness there, which can sometimes be in the way, of course, but also while it's helping here to climb up the ranks on this long nut, you're often not going to have over 9mm on a nut or the top of a bolt to play with. Which means so far the vintage Craftsman and the Tekton are the standouts in bolt tension versus that wrench thickness. But we still have the Wright, SK, Matco, Snap-on, and Snap-on FDX to tally, so let's get into that. So here's the Wright Tools, the Wrightgrip 2.0 combination wrench, our first one that's made in the USA. This is a satin chrome example, but they make polished ones of these too. The metric set goes for about $160 or $14.55 a piece, so quite a step up in price. The clearance is nothing crazy at 0.17mm, but also another specialty open-end design. Their Wrightgrip 2.0, which looks like an understated design complexity-wise to me, but is rumored to be the cat's pajamas, so let's check it out. This is a solid wrench. Once it's on a fastener, it's pretty glued to it. Dimensionally, it's nothing special, I feel, but nevertheless, it feels akin to vice grips once it's turning something, just no movement going on. This thing blitzes the competition, and well, the coupling nut too, which is the first thing to fail, not the wrench. The Wrightgrip is able to compress the nut in on itself, and additional turns not increasing tension because it's caused the nut to fail at 1540 psi. Above 121 foot-pounds or so on an open-end 16mm versus a grade 2 nut. And at 8.05mm, it's not simply due to that wrench width either. Yeah, it's good. Continuing on with the USA-made wrenches, we have SK. Their flare nut wrench did very well for us in our episodes, so we felt it earned a shot here as well. These are $18.30 a piece, or $238 for a 13-piece set. Like their flare nut wrench, it also is a bit shorter than normal for some reason. Maybe it's just their style. And speaking of dimensions, this one is 0.15mm over 16mm. Pretty good. But the SK represents our first legitimate shock of the day. Things start as usual, but at 993 psi, the wrench shoots off and rounds over the nut. And now what you're looking here isn't its second test, but we usually throw the wrench back on to just double check that we're not seeing a fluke. But not bad luck here, she's just done sub 1k psi. But per usual, we had at least one test with lower results than the one we're showing you here of 993. Just sort of weird stuff from a USA SK, it's kind of a bummer, but them's the data, so let's move on. To Matco, this I believe is from their top of the line wrench set currently, which are all spline drive on the box end. The Matco measures 0.18mm over, and also has a specialty open jaw, this time looking real fancy with lots of cuts and dimension changes. Not sure if it's a good thing considering the simple looking Wrightgrip did so well, but let's see. The Matco set is a pricey one at $440 for a 15-piece set, or $26.93 a wrench. But things are only going to get more pricey from here. But it performs too, making $1,320 or enough for third place, and the slimmest jaw into those top 3 places as well. Okay, last up we have Snap-on, and both Snap-on Flank Drive as well as Snap-on Flank Drive Plus, or FDX. To be honest, this is most of the reason I wanted us to test combination wrenches at all, to see that difference between the two here. The FDX design in general seems more targeted to their sockets, which fit and feel snugger on a bolt head, but on wrenches like this one, it's also bringing a specialty open-end design that looks like this, with plenty of cuts and grooves to increase that grip. Though this FDX, after some pretty minor use, has started to flake off layers of chrome, like a lot, which is weird and not something we've seen often with Snap-on stuff, but no reason to hide it from you here, so we're going to show it. Both wrenches measure 0.11mm over, or the lowest on the day when you figure out how to measure that FDX. Let's see the traditional flank drive Snap-on first. This is a $43.40 single wrench from a $434 10-piece set. This one wrench costs more than the first 4 sets we've tested. And no beating around the bush, it didn't make it up far on the list, 1125 psi. When double checking to see if that's a fluke, it's not able to build on that 1125 either. And as usual, we had at least one other lower run as well. It just never made a splash. It just sort of is what it is. But that may just justify the existence of Flank Drive Plus then, because here's the FDX on that same now buggered up first nut that the Snap-on couldn't move any further. So yeah, it's going to be good. And well, it is. The Flank Drive Plus wrench is no money grab, and unlike their sockets, which just plain don't fit on some bolts in my experience because they're so tight, this wrench fits on everything, the regular one does, but just grips better, much better, up to 1492 or second place. Just shy of maxing out this test setup before slipping, at which point it could no longer improve. Now, before we check out some valve grinding compound, we've done enough now to head over to our ranking and see how these all do. Like our last flare nut wrench episode, we're going to be ranking these on a scale of 1 to 10, not sequentially like in order, because if two wrenches make the same beans, they really should share the same score. Dimensionally, clearance-wise, over 16 millimeters, the snap-on gets both 10s here, which is oddly shared with the cheapo Olympia up here, then Gearwrench, then 8s here, and a 7 here, and so on up in size. You'll have to pardon the ranking list scrolling on this one, there's a lot of wrenches today. Then perhaps most importantly, we have bolt tension, the torque these wrenches applied to these soft hex nuts before slipping and failing. The Olympia shares bottom honors with the Crescent here, then it's Jetech and Sunex with 2 points, as well as the SK2, that's crazy. At the top end of things, we have the Snap-on, who didn't take absolute top honors, so gets a 9, and the Wright, who really gets a 10, but we normally give an extra point for maxing out the rig, so it gets an 11 here, our first one. Theoretically, its true PSI score could be 1600, 1650 plus, we don't know, because it maxed out that nut. Then Gearwrench, mainly due to the width of the jaw, but pretty good. The Matco and Vintage Craftsman next. What a comeback for the Vintage Craftsman, almost as surprising as the SK and Snap-on Traditional down here, which is surprising for different reasons. When we're talking performance per millimeter of jaw width, which if your bolt head is only, let's say, a realistic 6 to 7.5 millimeters thick, you'll be wanting, we have the FDX in first with 10 points here, then the super impressive Wright, then Matco, then Tekton, also quite impressive, that Tekton. When it comes to hardness, we're only going to touch on a few things we found interesting or odd. Wrench hardness per ASME standard should be between 38 and 55 HRC, which is a huge range. Harder doesn't often mean better, so we don't rank with this info, but we did see that the Olympia cheapie was only 26.1 HRC, which is basically meaning that it's not hardened at all. This is a wrench that's going to wear out or just bend or stop gripping on you eventually. The Jetech is a similar story, but 36.8 HRC, still out of and below what ASME standard would call a wrench, and probably not high enough quality of an alloy to reach higher hardness if treated. For the rest of these, pretty normal stuff, except interesting that the two Snap-on wrenches were exactly the same hardness, and quite high too, definitely from the same factory material there, and the SK was the hardest of all the wrenches, just like we saw in the flare nut episode. That one had sheared off on us. So let's see some total points averages, shall we? This is an average of their 3 scores. The Olympia gets a 5, the Jetech a 3.33, Crescent 2.66, ouch, Craftsman China 6.33, USA Craftsman a 7, very nice, Sunex 3.66, quite a drop, Tekton 6.33, Capri 4 1/3, Gearwrench 7, Wright gets 9 1/3, SK just 4 1/3, Matco 7.33, and Flank Drive 6.66, the mark of the beast, and Flank Drive Extra 9.66, putting the Snap-on FDX in first, followed closely by Wright Tools, then Matco. All of these are specialty jaws, by the way. Then Vintage Craftsman, Gearwrench, Snap-on regular, Tekton, China Craftsman, and so on. For sort of bargain DIY, just adding stuff to your cart, the China Craftsman is a good buy. I like the Tekton quite a bit more, but it costs more as well. The Gearwrench, as a ratcheting wrench, definitely can rely on that open end as well, and it's better than we've seen from their standard wrenches, so maybe stick to Taiwan there. But for like every weekend use or a professional making money with these things, it seems like the top stuff up here stands out. These Wrightgrip wrenches, man, $160, USA lifetime warranty, 3 times cheaper per piece than the Snap-on. If that doesn't look like a screaming deal to you, I don't know what is. Now, compared to the Snap-on Flank Drive you're seeing here, it can be quite a difference with that Wrightgrip. The high hardness of 53 to 54 of the Snap-on comes into play a bit here with this fracture using a cheater bar. Not that you should expect that to happen very often, but the 10 points softer Wrightgrip 2.0, even with the cheater bar, grips and turns the same bolt. Even versus the FDX Snap-on, some advantages can be seen in other people's testing, not just ours, like Mr. Subaru here. On the 9/16 grade 8 bolt head with a Wright wrench is able to break that head off, where the Flink Drive Plus just sort of gets close but ultimately rounds that head over. On a fresh bolt, when comparing the love marks these two wrenches make, while a simplistic design, the Wrightgrip leaves 3 marks and it's further up on the flats, or sort of down into the middle of the flats, versus on the hex of the Snap-on FDX here, which is sort of the idea of not rounding over the corners. But there was another specialty open end that didn't appear to move the needle in our test, the Sunex, the V-groove drive end in the jaw as well. But when looking at just how a wrench works mechanically from a physics standpoint, I'm not so sure this does anything. Looking here at the Wrightgrip, as the wrench is turned, the top side comes under tension and the bottom side experiences the same sort of tension, equal opposite forces and all. They fight against each other to grip, the specialty teeth helping to increase bite and friction on the flank of the hex to situate that tension away from the corners. The FDX here sort of works in the same way. But wrenches with a V-groove, while it seems intuitive that it would help, like the SKX frame being shown here, it may be touching 2 additional sides, but they are experiencing 0 tension because they have no opposing side to fight with and grip against. Now, if you added 2 bits sort of on the corners here, like a flare nut wrench, that would put these under tension then, which is why flare nut wrenches all have a V-groove on the opposing side. But instead, theoretically, let's just eliminate everything but the 2 sides here and remove the work that the top and bottom jaw are doing. How much torque do you think you could apply in a wrench with just these 2 V-jaws? Nada. In fact, as soon as these 2 sides see any forces, they will just work to push the hex bolt out slightly and away from the throat until they're not being used, as there's nothing stopping that force on the opposing side here. So does that mean the SKX frame wrenches are bad? No, not at all. But it might be more of an aesthetic or marketing choice rather than one driven by engineers. And speaking of SK, in a rare case, at least for us, their USA wrench didn't do all so hot in our testing multiple times over. So let's try to employ an old-timer trick, or at least one the gray hair in your shop tells you works, but you have no way to be sure, and that's adding some abrasive valve grinding compound to your wrench to see if that grips soft stuff better. Increasing that friction coefficient and therefore maybe achieving more torque? Let's find out. Here's the same SK wrench that made it as high as 998 for us, or 993 median as you saw. We put some on the fastener and the wrench just sort of to be sure. So it made it up to 1102, whereas we previously never crested 1000, a pretty cut and dry 10% gain there. We found that in some cases it's a 8 to 12% increase, and on some wrenches like the Sunex and the Snap-on, it didn't do anything, but on no wrenches did it hurt their numbers, so valve grind compound away, I say, myth confirmed. I appreciate you joining us on this one and our hand tool episodes in general. Suggest more wrenches below if you'd like to see more, and thanks for watching.